But we've come to the end of our time in Judges. And to quote Monty Python, there was much rejoicing.
Yeah.
I know it's been kind of rough sometimes. Some people probably really enjoyed it. Other people are like, when are we done with this? It's been a crazy thing. And throughout our time, we've seen this cycle. We've seen the cycle appear. Remember this thing? We saw people abandoning God. They abandoned God and they worshiped foreign gods. And this brought about God's righteous anger because they weren't doing what God had commanded them. And it brings about consequences for their actions. Consequences of their own misbehavior leading to consequences. And then, as these consequences got worse and worse, people would cry out to God to rescue them. And God, being a loving and gracious God, who would raise up a deliverer, a judge who would come and free the people. And then it would lead to a time of peace. And all would be good, all would be well, until that judge passed away. When after that judge's death, we would see the cycle repeating over and over and over again. We saw the cycle happening with a man named Othniel, and then with someone named Ehud, and then Deborah and Barak, Gideon, Japheth, and Samson. Each week, as the cycle repeated, it seemed like things were just getting worse. That the people would continue to reject God. That there would be continual and even stronger repercussions of their actions. And the reliability of the judge is always get more and more in question. And this cycle that we looked at begins to look like a downward spiral. Things would keep getting worse and worse. And we think about downward spirals. Think about these things that happen in our lives. They often start out with something small, right? A flirtatious glance with someone, if left unchecked, spirals into an extramarital affair. A little lie that won't hurt anybody can spiral into deceit and broken trust. Borrowing a few dollars from your work may spiral into criminal activity, embezzlement, or things like that. We think these little things that we think aren't that big a deal, but left unchecked begin to spiral down and down, and things get worse and worse. Maybe you've seen that in your life or someone else that you know's life. You see this downward spiral occurring. Today, as we come to our final chapter, our final story in Judges, we're going to see this downward spiral go completely off the rockers. It starts off with maybe something small. It starts out with this little thing that seems almost insignificant, but into the greater story of the people of Israel, we're going to see things get worse and worse and worse. And a few weeks ago, I did this cute little drawing thing, right? When we saw the cute story of Samson. But if I were to do that today, we would have to have a lot of censored images because this story gets pretty intense. And if it were, a movie, it'd be like rated R. So be forewarned that the story I'm about to share with you is pretty intense. And it starts out with a Levite who is one of God's people. Right? He's one of the chosen tribe that's supposed to be there to lead the people in worship of God. And it says that in the very beginning of the story, it says that a Levite acquired a woman as his concubine. First off, acquiring a woman. See, you can see already the perspective of what's going on there. It's not like he met this woman and they fell in love. He acquired a woman. And a concubine, it's a second-class wife. Right? To the man, it's more like a sex object, someone he could use for his own pleasure, but didn't really have to have much connection with her. And this Levite, then, in a sense, is like both her husband and her master. And we see that this was a common thing back then. You don't see it really in our culture, really. People, at least officially, having concubines, but we see it back then. There was a pagan culture where that would happen. We also see it in the stories of in the Old Testament. We see Abraham, Jacob, and David, and Solomon, all people having multiple wives and concubines. But every time these stories appear in the Bible, we see how they don't work out well. That these men who kind of forsaken the marriage that God had intended, causes pain and heartache and suffering. So we can tell at the beginning of the story that something is just not right. That this Levite, who's supposed to be set apart by God, is taking this concubine, and you'll see throughout the story, you kind of see, he views her as his object, his thing that he wants, right? The thing that he uses, not as a person, but as his own possession. And this woman, for some reason, probably, and somebody don't blame her, it says that she is unfaithful to him, and that she has her own affair, and then she leaves him. She goes back home. She doesn't want anything to do with this Levite. She runs away back to her father's home. She's there for 4 months. 4 months. Until finally the Levite decides he wants her for some reason. We don't know his motivation, why he would want her, but he decides it's time to get back his possession. So he goes and gets her to get her back. And when he gets to her father's home, her father welcomes them in with arms wide open. And he begins to wine and dine and encourages them to stay longer and longer. You might think this is kind of strange, but you think, okay, well, he's just being hospitable. There's this idea of hospitality that was very prevalent in their culture. And they also maybe understood that there's a penalty for what his daughter had done. That being under the Mosaic law, this Levite could have had her executed, bringing shame to not just his daughter, but bringing death to his daughter, but shame to their family. And so, in a sense, this father is relieved that the Levite has come, not to press charges, not to have his daughter executed, but just to take her back home. And so he's there, and then after about 5 days of whining and dining, this Levite decides it's time to go home. So he gathers up his servant and his concubine, and they begin the journey back to where they lived. But something happens along the way. They have to stop at this town, this place to spend the night. And there's a village that's kind of ruled by the tribe of Benjamin. And they're in the city square, and they're trying to find a place to spend the night. And this old man comes up to him, an old man from the tribe of Ephraim, who's living in that town, and he tells them to come with him. It's not safe where they're staying. So he takes them back to his house, and he treats them well. He takes care of their animals. And then this is where the story gets disturbing. It says that these wicked men come, and they demand that this man give them the Levite. They want to come and have their way with him. And the old man says to these wicked men, he says, please do not do this evil. This man is coming to my house. He's like, this man is protected in my house. Don't do this evil. Don't commit such a horrible outrage. But then he says, let me give you my virgin daughter and this man's concubine. And for some reason, they accept this offer, and they take these two women and they abuse them. That next morning, this concubine is trying to make her way back to this man's house, and she ends up dying. And the Levite comes down, and he sees this woman, this property. He's disturbed, and he takes her body back home, and then he cuts it into 12 pieces and sends it to the tribes of Israel. And people, things have just gone from bad to horrific. The story doesn't stop there. The people assemble and they're like, why would you do such a thing? And all the leaders of Israel, except for the Benjaminites, right? The one tribe that was responsible, they gathered together a council to try to figure out what was going on. And the man explains what had happened and demands a verdict. And they say they're going to go and arrest these men that did such evil. But the Benjaminites were like, no, you're not going to do this. And so we're not going to hand over these men to you. And instead, it starts a kind of civil war. And the people of Israel are fighting against their tribe of Benjamin. And thousands of people are dying on both sides, back and forth. Finally, the Israelites begin to overtake and they begin to annihilate the entire tribe of Benjamin, except for about 600 men who escape off into the woods. And that after they escape, they've taken care of all these other people. The men of Israel, they make an oath. They swear they are not going to give their daughters over to any of these men in the Benjaminites. They're not going to give their daughters over. Then, a few days later, they begin to have compassion and think, how can we do this to our own people? And they think, what are we supposed to do? We've already made this vow. We've made this oath that we're not going to do this. We can't just go back on our word. So what they do is they decide there's this city that didn't join. It kind of remained neutral during the war. So they go and they level that city, except for 400 young women. They give them to the Benjaminites in order to not break their vow. They realize that's still not enough. There's still need more women. So they tell the Benjaminites, well, when there's this festival in this town of Shiloh, you can go while the girls are out there dancing and all that, just grab some more women, and they can be your wives. It's a disturbing story how one thing that happened with this Levite, this spiraled out of control, the civil war, and just the abandonment of morality. The story is just disturbing. It shows how things can just spiral out of control, one thing leading to another. A man who devalued a woman spirals into this gruesome assault and murder and civil war and genocide and enslavement because these men didn't want to break their vows. This final story just leaves a bad taste in your mouth. How could it doesn't have a happy ending? How could we go any further? Why does it not end like this? And the final verse, the whole book says, in those days, Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. See, the downward spiral that was going on is shaped by people's perspective. And they're shaped by people's perspective. They had this idea that they did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. They thought, this is what is right, this is what we're going to do, so that's okay. Well, if I think it's right, then it's right. Well, we have to see this is a repeated theme throughout Judges. As Deborah read earlier, this is at the beginning of the book. This begins with where it says the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And that's repeated at least like 6 or 7 times throughout the book. And then it switches at the end of the book, it switches to this phrase that they did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. See how they're very similar, right? Doing evil in the eyes of the Lord versus what seemed right in their own eyes. As our friend Tim Keller, who's been the book we've been looking at, says that the term the eyes of the Lord, in contrast with own eyes, teaches us that sin does not ultimately consist of violating our conscience or violating our personal standards or violating community standards, but rather consists of violating God's will for us. So saying it's not what we think is right or what we think is wrong, that's sin. It's going against what God knows is right and what God knows is wrong. Because we think some things are okay, but other things aren't. And we can really get a deeper picture of that if we look at the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus gets up and as he's preaching, he said things like, "You've heard it said that do not murder." We're like, yeah, do not murder is bad. Then he says, "I'll tell you this, whoever is angry with their brother or sister is subject to judgment. Whoever insults someone is subject to the court. Whoever calls someone a fool is subject to hellfire." So Jesus is saying, you think it's just not murder, but I'm telling you, if you're speaking rudely or meanly or insulting others, that's just as equal as murder. Or Jesus then said, "You've heard that don't commit adultery." Right? He says, if you look at a woman with lust in your heart, you committed adultery with her. So it's not just, oh, I didn't commit adultery. Jesus is saying it's deeper than that. Your eyes say, oh, well, I didn't commit adultery. But the Lord's eyes saying, if you look at her with lust, then you committed adultery with her. Jesus said, you've heard it said, don't break your oaths. But Jesus said, well, what I think, don't make oaths, just say yes or no. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. We saw the damage that caused when these men made oaths. They made this oath that, oh, we're not going to give our women as wives to these men. And then they had to think, how do I keep my oath of help these people out? And they chose a terrible way of doing it. Or we think about, Jesus said, you've heard an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. Like, oh, you did something to me, I should be able to do something to you. Jesus says, that's not how I see it. I say, don't resist an evildoer. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also. So just said, you've heard, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. Okay, yeah, that's right. Yeah, we should love our enemy, or love our neighbors, not our enemies. But Jesus said, no, love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. Because we have this idea of this is what we should do. We think about it right. This is in our own eyes, what is right. We do that, and that's okay. Think about all the things that people have done that they thought were right. And it's caused tragedy all over the world because they were doing what they thought was right in their own eyes. But we have to look at it in the eyes of the Lord. And it says in our scripture, we've been looking at in our story that says the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And then they explain what that is. It says they forsook the Lord. They followed and worshiped various gods and the people around them. They aroused the Lord's anger. They turned their eyes away from God towards other things. Things that they didn't think were that bad, right? They think, oh, well, it's not that bad that we're worshiping these foreign gods. And they thought, oh, idolatry is not that bad. But God told them not pay attention to these other gods, not surrender to these other gods. But they did. And we think in our own lives, well, we don't have idols, right? We don't have little things that we worship, little statues that we bow down to. But that's not always what idolatry is. Idolatry is pretty much putting anything in place of God. Anything that we lift above God is an idol, right? It could be something that's good in general. It could be something, like our families, which could be good, but if we worship them over God, then they become our idols. Or our career doesn't have to be bad, right? But if we elevate it to a status above God, then it's becoming our idol. So there's so many things that we lift up above God. And those things that God's saying, that's not what you're called to do. In my eyes, you might not think of it, in your eyes, it might not be a big deal, but in my eyes, That is evil. That is what I told you not to. That is you forsaking me. So then it comes all down to, what are we surrendering our lives to? What are we giving our lives to? See, the passage, the story of Judges ends with this idea that in those days, Israel had no king. And this is a line that's repeated 4 times at the end of Judges. And in today's story, it starts the story that they have no king, and it ends the story that they have no king. So the author was saying that they need a king, that if they had someone to rule them, a king that, like the other nations around them, that they would be able to escape this downward spiral. Because then we take a look, we flip the pages of our Bibles, and we get to 1 Samuel. After we get to 1 Samuel, we see the people want a king, and so God brings Saul, the people's king. Tall and royal, people think he's amazing. But he has an ego problem, an anger issue. So then God brings up David, ruddy and strong, a man after God's own heart, who seduces a woman, has her husband killed. Then we have Solomon, the wise king, the one God commissioned to build the temple, who married over 700 women and had 300 concubines. And he allowed them to invest in faith, influence his faith, and drive the people apart from God. And because of Solomon, the nation was split into 2 kingdoms. As we go through the Old Testament, we'll see that most of these kingdoms were kept pulling their people away from God. In a sense where a good portion of the nation of Israel got wiped off the face of the map, another section got sent into exile. So surely the author of Judges isn't saying that we just need to surrender to some earthly king and that we will escape some sort of downward spiral. And we can see that in our own time, that there's, because no king, no leader, no president or prime minister can really stop people from descending down the spiral, sin, shame. We see in the church people idolizing pastors and leaders, and then these people getting caught up into fame and popularity, and what's one small step begins a downward spiral, beginning to pull people away from God. We too have no earthly king that can save us from this downward spiral. And so we can search all, we want to try to find someone who can rescue us. We know, as Timothy Keller says, we all search for a king, someone to rule us, someone to rescue us. There is only one man who provides what we're looking for. We must look to the greatest king, the ultimate judge, or we will serve a false one. And this morning, in our call to worship is taken from Psalm 24. It says in here, the psalmist is asking the question, who is the King of glory? The Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord, mighty in battle. Who is the King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. We have to ask ourselves in our lives, who is the King of glory? Who are we surrendering our lives to? There's a Christian group, singing group known as Third Day, and they have a song called King of Glory. And they based off of the song, and the song says, who is this King of glory that pursues me with his love and haunts me with each hearing of his softly spoken word, my conscience a reminder of forgiveness that I need? Who is this King of glory who offers it to me? And they answer the question, they say, his name is Jesus, precious Jesus, the Lord Almighty, the King of my heart, King of glory. See, no earthly king, no president, no prime minister, no leader in all the world will ever be able to truly rescue us from the downward spiral. The only way that we can escape that, the only way we can get free from the clutches of this downward spiral is to surrender to the King of Glory, to Jesus. Jesus is the humble King, the God who lived in heaven, but was not consumed with his own heavenly privileges, but he came down, he became one of us, he took on flesh, he walked among us, he showed us what it was like, who God was like, he showed us how he lived a perfect, blameless life. He came to be our spotless lamb, the sacrifice for our sin. He gave his life for us so that we could escape this death and this downward spiral. And he rose again, and he offers us all new life, a life that rescues us out of this downward spiral. A life that we open our eyes, we fix our eyes on him, he will help free us from the sin that entangles us. He invites us all, you and me, and we're even in the midst of caught in the spiral, to lift our eyes to him, to surrender our hearts to him, to give our lives to him, because he loves us so much, and he's poured out his love on us. He is the King of Glory. He's the Lord Almighty. Jesus is the only one that rescues us from the downward spiral. He rescued us by giving of his life. He rescued us by giving us his amazing grace. This is the grace that we saw lived out in the story of Judges, that God would continually raise up a deliverer. But it's growing with these deliverers that were in Judges were never perfect. They never were able to completely deliver. But Jesus, when we surrender our lives, he can deliver us. We fix our eyes on him, not ourselves. He rescues us and he frees us from the bondage. And now we can sing that our chains are gone. We've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me. Like a flood, his mercy reigns. Unending love. Amazing grace.